Welcome to our weekly Church on the Rock podcast. For more information, visit us at churchak.org, download our Church on the Rock AK app, or like us on our Facebook page. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy our weekly podcast.
We're in week number 2 of our series, He Gets Us, and today we're going to be digging into the topic of love. Ooh, yes, that's right. Yesterday, in between doing some sermon prep, playing a little bit of basketball with my girls, because at least my driveway's free of snow, unlike my yard, I would not recommend, I did this yesterday, going back and looking at this time last year. What did your yard look like? Just remind yourself we had record snowfall this year, and it's not going away until winter comes again. So anyways, but in the midst of all that, if you don't know this, my wife loves plants, and this is what I spent part of my day doing yesterday. Anybody recognize this? Anybody know what this is? Go ahead and confess if you know. This is a grow operation. That's what that is down in my crawl space. I'm not even going to tell you what it's for. No, it's for my wife loves gardening and flowers in particular, and she is a whiz at gardening. She can just, it's absolutely stunning. But this is how obsessed she is. We've collected these lights over the years. Some of them, I'm pretty sure that my bills are not going down since, it got warmer. They're going up. And now all the plants are downstairs underneath these lights, draining the power from our city. But you would think, that to do this sort of thing, I don't know, for me, it feels like an act of love and service to my wife. I don't know if you've ever heard of love languages before, but the basic idea is that everyone has ways that they express love and ways that they receive love the best. And so the book on love languages really highlights 5 different types of ways we give love and receive love. So if you're married, take notes. If you're not married, take notes in case you ever want to be married. If you think you're going to get married, take notes. Anyways, you get the idea. Here's the big 5 for the love languages. First one is acts of service. Like putting in lights downstairs in a crawl space when you're 6'2" and the space is 3 inches tall. Words of affirmation. You can ask my staff. I definitely do not excel at this one, but I definitely have words of affirming the things that we need to do better. Which is the opposite of words of affirmation, in case you were wondering and you didn't know that, men. Words of affirmation, quality time. That is not, per se, watching a movie together. You have to let them decide what the quality time is. Receiving gifts and physical touch, which isn't as weird as it sounds, because it could just be a hand on the shoulder, right? I value you, I love you, I respect you. Acts of service, words of affirmation, quality time, receiving gifts, and physical touch. Of course, they did leave one out that I thought was pretty critical, bacon. I don't know, like almost every morning, Kitri cooks bacon, and I just think, I know I'm loved. So a little bacon during sermon prep yesterday. Here's the principle. I actually don't get to decide how you receive love and affection. most of us would really appreciate the other person receiving love in the way that we receive love, because it's typically the way that comes most natural to us. And so the things that I really enjoy, I actually tend to express them easily to other people. And I just think to myself, why can't you just receive my favorite way to be loved? But you can hear it as soon as you say it, that that's a little bit selfish and maybe narcissistic, that I would expect you to be the same as me. I don't get to decide how you receive love and affection. In fact, in a marriage relationship and even in a friendship, it actually is my responsibility to discover how it is that you receive love. Fortunately, even in a staff environment, I have staff who will tell me, typically when I give them a word of affirmation once a year, when I give them a word of affirmation, they'll tell me, like, you don't know how much that means to me. And I'm thinking, you didn't know I liked you this whole time? Like, I'd tell you if I didn't. But I realize often I don't deliberately find out how the other person actually experiences or feels or receives love and affection. Here's the second part of this principle. If we desire to receive love in unique and specific ways, it stands to reason that God does too. Like that maybe God has specified some ways that he receives love and affection. Which brings me to the Shema. Yes, it's a prayer. It's prayed in the morning and it's prayed in the evenings in Israel. And the Shema is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It goes into Deuteronomy 6:4-5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. This is in some ways describing how we love God, but it's really describing the comprehensiveness of how God is to be loved. In fact, when they say the Shema in Israel, they will hold up their pinky like this. It's representation that there is more power in God's little finger than in all of creation combined. That he is sovereign and has authority and power. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, and with all your strength. So here's my question for us today. Who defines what it looks like to love God? And what is God's love language? Well, in John chapter 14, Jesus describes what it looks like to love God. I just think we might not like it as much. If you love me, obey my commandments. That sounds like a parenting pro tip to your kids. Like, if you love me, could you just do what I asked you to do? Like if you love me, obey my commandments. I think we could probably all admit, other than Pastor Pete, that none of us do that perfectly all of the time. But I need to clarify something here, because the principle is this: in order to keep a commandment, you must know a commandment. We've been looking at this series, He Gets Us, and sort of the plot twist last week was, but do we get Him? Do we understand Him? Do we know what God is like and what God likes? There's really only one way to know that fundamentally, and that is to start with the Word of God. I mean, if the actual desire is to love God in a way that God receives love, then it would be critical for you and I to know what it looks like to keep His Word. That's why in the Old Testament is filled with these commands, in particular to rulers and kings, that you would take the Word of God, you would hide it in your hearts, that you would know what his word said. It's why David says things like, I love your law. Not because we love legalism, but because the law tells him something about what God likes. And what he desires is to express love and affection to God in the way that God receives it. Jesus is engaged in a debate with some of the religious leaders of his day, people who claim to know the Old Testament scriptures, the teachers of the law, and they're sort of grilling Jesus, and Jesus is, of course, giving brilliant answers to their questions. And one of the teachers of the law hears the answers that Jesus is giving, and he's going to ask the central question that was being debated among the rabbis at the time. He is going to ask the question, Jesus, what's the most important commandment? Depending on what school of thought you were from in the Jewish community, you believed there were either 333 commands or 67 commands, but they had different thoughts on how many commands there were in the Old Testament. And what he wants to know is, Jesus, which one's the most important command? And this is Jesus' reply. Jesus replied, the most important commandment is this: listen, O Israel, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the one and only Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. The most important commandment is the Shema, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And he says this, the second is just a little less important. I want you to pause and think about this for a moment. What's the most important commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, with all your soul, with all your strength, with everything you have. And the second commandment is no less important. Often it feels a lot harder, but it's no less important. Is equally important, love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. It's a challenge, isn't it? 1 John 4, all who confess that Jesus is the Son of God have God living in them, and they live in God. We know how much God loves us, and we have put our trust in his love. God is love, and all who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. And as we live in God, our love grows more perfect, so we will not be afraid on the day of judgment, but we can face him with confidence because we live like Jesus here in this world. It's interesting because so much of the focus has been put on love by our definition, but here love is actually defined for us. That all who live in love live in God. God is love, and here's how we have confidence. What does it look like to live in love? Well, we live like Jesus here in this world. That you can't separate the idea of living in love from the idea of living like Jesus. He actually goes on, if someone says, I love God, but hates a Christian brother or sister, that person is you said it, not me. For if we don't love people we can see, how can we love God whom we cannot see? And I've often thought, it's much easier. Have you seen them? And yet the reality is that he is describing what it looks like to live in Jesus, to live like Jesus, to live in love. That it's actually self-contradictory to say, I'm living like Jesus in the world, I'm living in love in the world, and I hate my brother or sister in Christ. We know we love God's children if we love God and obey his commandments. We've sort of bifurcated, we've separated those two things in our world. Love of God or love for God and obeying his commandments. It's interesting when you hear people, even Christian actors and actresses. Yes, there are Christian actors and actresses outside of just the Chosen series. When you hear them get up and thank God, it's very rare to hear someone thank Jesus. Because it's still somewhat socially acceptable to thank God, but the question isn't really, do you say you love God? The question is, do you show that you love God? Which brings me to, I love that for you. This is kind of like You Do You Boo, but it's a newer version of it. It can be said in two ways, in case you didn't know. It can be very genuine and authentic. I think Maddie would say it in a very genuine and authentic way, like, no, I love that for you. But if you just put a hint of sarcasm to it, which would rarely happen, but happens sometimes in our office environment, oh no, I love that for you. It's a sort of a way of saying, that's not for me. I'm glad you like it, but not so much, right? I love that for you. Which brings me to the privatization of faith in our world. In fact, I would say the privatization of the faith. We live in a world that wants to personalize everything about how we worship God. But you have to be very careful when you begin to do that, because this principle, I think, applies. Personal preferences must not take priority over biblical commands. And so you hear people say things all the time, like the big five. I worship God in my own way. I love Jesus, but I don't like Christians. I get it. I love God, but I'm not sure about Jesus. I love God, but I don't trust the Bible. I love God, but I won't give up blank. You fill it in. Whatever it is, I love God, but I'm not willing to let go of this. I'm not willing to abandon this preference or this lifestyle or this particular addiction. I love God, but I won't give up this. And when you begin to look at statements like this, you begin to realize that it is in our culture very popular to make your relationship with God privatized. It's my personal preferences. And we get a lot of this from the language of you have a personal relationship with God. But don't confuse that to mean you get to decide the terms of it. Those are actually two very different things. It'd be similar to the illustration of a marriage relationship in which you decide how you're going to express love to them. But all of us would have a threshold for this, right? Some of us are like, well, I don't have to be inside of a building. You're right, you do not have to be inside of a building, but we are in Alaska. I mean, there's just some practical elements, right? But when you begin to say things like, I don't have to gather together with God's people, he seems to think it's really important. Do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together. I don't have to fellowship with other believers. I have my own personal relationship with Jesus. And yet we would all draw the line somewhere. We would say, I can express affection or love towards God in all kinds of different ways, but can you do it through child sacrifice? Because in the ancient world, that was very popular. In fact, I've been in India with people in the jungles of Andhra Pradesh and met with a woman who was telling her story and just a few weeks before had offered one of her children as a sacrifice to the witch doctors for sins that she had committed against the gods. And all of us would say, no, you can't express love in that way. Why not, if it's up to you how you express love to God? Or did God set the parameters for how we express love and affection to him? Which brings me to pronouns. One of our favorite So weird how words have new meanings depending on what's going on in the world. I don't know what you're thinking. I was just thinking about pronouns. But it's interesting in a world where we want to say everyone can use whatever pronouns they want. We don't seem to like the idea of the ones that God picks for himself. In fact, Bibles are being rewritten as we speak in order to do away with that. And yet God clearly identifies himself as him. And Jesus is the Son, and the Holy Spirit, believe it or not, masculine language is used to describe the Holy Spirit. And of course, we all know that that is because men are so much better than nobody. I didn't want that to become quotable. Here's principle number 2. Personal preferences don't override biblical commands, but also personal definitions don't take priority over biblical descriptions. There's actually a reason that God uses the language that God uses in the scriptures, and it has far more to do with the story that he is telling in the world. In fact, the scriptures are written in familial language. It's actually really important that you don't do away with it, because you begin to undo the illustration that is the scriptures, that God is a father who has children and that he cares for them and nurtures them and loves them, but also that the church is a bride, like Israel was a bride. There's an illustration, a portrait being painted in the scriptures, but don't get confused, because I'll ask you this question: is God a man or a woman? And you immediately realize we're dealing with something entirely different than masculine and feminine when you ask the question in this way. In fact, God actually answers this question in particular. Numbers 23:19, God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. He has said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? But he's not actually dealing here with men and women. He's dealing with humanity. That he's different, altogether different than you and I. In fact, in Psalm 50, verse 19, somebody just said, thank God. That's true. You do damage with words and use your tongue to deceive. You plot against your brother, you slander your own brother. When you did these things, I was silent, so you thought I was exactly like you. But now I will condemn you and state my case against you. Carefully consider this, you who reject God. You know, we've done this throughout human history over and over and over again. We're at risk of doing it currently in our day, even in the church, is redefining who God is so that God is more like me, more like my personal preferences, more like my political leanings, more like all of the things that I like. I love the statement that was made years ago when God created man in his image in the beginning, and ever since, man has returned that favor. Let's recreate God in our image. In fact, it's what religious practices like Mormonism do. They simply turn God into a man who became God rather than altogether different than you and I. Which brings me to, if it looks like a duck, if it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, what is it? It's a pretty good guess. I heard somebody out in the foyer just yell a duck. That's right, whoever that was, mystery person. If it looks like a duck. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17 and verse 19. I love whenever Paul writes in this sort of language. I don't want you to be confused. I mean, I know it's all God's word, but to be really clear, with the Lord's authority, I say this: live no longer as the Gentiles or ducks. Live no longer as the Gentiles or unbelievers do, for they are hopelessly confused. Does this sound familiar? hopelessly confused. Verse 19, they have no sense of shame. They live for lustful pleasure and eagerly practice every kind of impurity. But that isn't what you learned about Christ. So stop telling lies. Let us tell our neighbors the truth, for we are all parts of the same body. And don't sin by letting anger control you. If you are a thief, quit stealing, in particular from Portable One over here. Anyways, we can talk about that later. If you're a thief, quit stealing. Instead, use your hands for good, hard work, and then give generously to others in need. Don't use foul or abusive language. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. It's interesting that we often think we can behave in all kinds of ways that are contrary to what we learned about Christ, or contrary to what it looks like to live like Jesus in the world, and yet still consider ourselves followers of Jesus. But if it looks like a duck, and it walks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, there's a real good chance it's just a duck. And that's fine as long as we can admit that it's a duck, rather than pretend that it isn't. I've made this distinction lots of times before you feel like you're going to sink into too much guilt and shame, and myself as well. We're talking about direction, not perfection, right? What direction am I moving? And the question is, am I moving in the direction of becoming more and more like Jesus, or am I clinging to my personal preferences and definitions? He goes on just to sort of ease the pressure here for you, because maybe you're sitting there thinking like, oh, I know exactly who I'm thinking of right now. They walk like a duck, they talk like a duck, and they quack like a duck. And so just be real careful, because this isn't actually for them, it's for us. Well, mostly you, but it's also for, okay, you get the idea. Romans 2, verses 1 through 4. When you say, they are wicked and should be punished, you are condemning yourself. For you who judge others do these very same things. Now, maybe you're thinking, no, I don't do the exact same things. You should see what they did. But it's the same motivations. We talked about this last week. Like, what is the core motivation? There are just a handful of core motivations that drive all of the sorts of behaviors that you see in the world. And I can see those same core motivations in me over and over and over again. Be careful when you're like, give it to them. You're condemning yourself. For you who judge others do these very same things. And we know that God, in his justice, will punish anyone who does such things, because he is love. It's part of it, by the way. Since you judge others for doing these things, why do you think you can avoid God's judgment when you do the same things? Now listen to this. Don't you see how wonderfully kind, tolerant, and patient God is with you? I don't know about you. I see it for me. Like, I know me pretty well. And when I think about every thought that goes through my head, when I think about everything I think about doing, let alone the things that I am doing or I do, when I think about those things, I think, he is so kind to me. He is so generous to me. He is so patient with me. Does this mean nothing to you? Can't you see that his kindness is intended to turn you from your sin? This is the principle. God's kindness is intended to lead to our faithfulness. He is faithful. It's in his very character, his nature, his DNA, if he has DNA. Like, God is faithful, but his kindness is intended to lead you and I towards faithfulness. And sometimes it feels painfully incremental. Like, I think I'm moving in this direction, but the reality is it's the intention of the kindness of the Lord, the patience of the Lord, the goodness of the Lord, is that it would actually lead you somewhere, not give you permission to stay where you are. Otherwise, you've misunderstood the kindness and the patience and the gentleness of the Lord. If you believe it's intended to allow you to remain here, you have misunderstood the purpose of it. Its intention is to move you towards faithfulness and obedience. When I think about the ways that the Lord has expressed love towards us, when I think about the ways in which he has given words of affirmation about why he created us, his affection for us, his love for us, when I think about the gifts that he's given to us, for he so loved us that he would give his only Son, the quality time that he spends with us. I will never leave you nor forsake you. When I think about the physical touch expressed in the New Testament in the person of Jesus, when you read through the New Testament scriptures and you just look at the places where it says, and Jesus touched, he's like touching people all the time, like a touchy-feely, like people who should not be touched according to the culture, right? People with leprosy, people with diseases and illnesses, people who are clearly sinful, and that Jesus is placing his hand on their shoulder over and over. When you read in the scriptures, when people have visions in the throne room of God and they fall down on their face as though they were dead, it will say over and over again, and a hand touched me. I want you to know that you're loved. He's expressed love to us in all the ways that we receive it. Which brings me to Love and Respect, which, by the way, is another great marriage book. Love and Respect. My only issue with the book, because the book totally makes sense, and I know what they're talking about, and the basic premise of the book is that, that women need to be loved and men need to be respected. Which, I don't know, it just makes men sound a little bit weak, although it is true. Women need to be loved, men need to be respected. But here's the question that I wrestle with whenever I read the title in this way. It's, do only women need love? And only men need respect? Because I'm pretty sure it was some women who wrote the song on respect. Like I don't think it's exclusively, maybe primarily, but I actually think it's confusing the word love a little bit. In fact, I think both need love. We all want to know we are valued, and the actions we take to express that value are love. We primarily, culturally, think of love as a feeling. Love is not described primarily as a feeling in the scriptures. Love is an action. How do you know that I love you? Because I express it in ways that you receive it best. How do I know that you love me? Because you show respect towards me. How do I know that you love me? Because you spend quality time with me. How do I know that you love me? Because it is expressed in action. Love is a verb. It actually has action almost always when it's referenced in the scriptures. Now, you've heard the story before. We actually looked at the story of Peter just a few weeks ago coming into our Easter series. I think Pastor Paul was the one who had preached on it. And as we were looking at the story of Peter, there's this moment. Peter is told by the Lord that you're going to deny me 3 times. Before the rooster crows in the morning, like before dawn, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter's like, you don't know what you're talking about, Jesus. I love you so much. And there he stands by the fire. It says, I love the context that it gives us. And a small girl. I just imagine it's one of my daughters, right? A small girl comes and says to him, hey, aren't you one of those disciples? No. You need glasses. That's my paraphrase. Comes a second time. I think you're one of the disciples. You don't know what you're talking about. The third time, he's just all out enraged, curses at them and like, I am not one of them. And then the rooster crows. And it dawns on him like instantly. You probably had that experience before, like, so much guilt and so much shame on Peter in that moment. And Peter takes off. Jesus is crucified. He's buried. Peter is clearly at a loss as to what to do next. And so his conclusion is, since Jesus isn't here for me to express love to him, to apologize to him, since I can't see him physically, I guess I'll just go back to my old life. So he goes back to fishing. To be clear, he apparently wasn't very good at it to begin with, because when Jesus found them the first time, they were catching no fish. And when Jesus comes to them this time, they're catching no fish. Both times they need a miracle to catch some fish. He should have picked something else to do with his life, I think, personally. But Jesus comes the second time, and he comes out, and they're out there, and they've caught no fish, fishing through the night, and Jesus says the same thing that he said to them when he first called them to come and follow him. And they cast their nets, and they catch a whole boatload, literally, of fish, and Peter instantly realizes what's going on. He strips off his outer garments, and he launches himself into the water. It sounds like in the text, the boat gets there roughly the same time as Peter. That's just impulsive people for you. They spend a lot more energy doing the same thing that everyone else could do much more efficiently. And Peter gets up there, and Jesus begins to ask him a question. Peter, do you love me? You know I love you. Of course I love you. Then do something. I mean, it sounds really beautiful, feed my sheep, but it's actually take action then if you say that you love me. Peter, do you love me? Oh, you know I love you. Then do something. Take action. Feed my sheep. Here it is. A third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. The text really gives us, and Peter wept when he asked the question a third time. How many times did he deny the Lord? How many times does the Lord ask him the question, do you love me? What Peter realizes in this moment is that Jesus is saying, we're all right. You're restored. My love made a way for you. My action that I took on the cross has made it possible for you to not just come back into relationship and fellowship with me, but actually to take action for me. To display your love by feeding my sheep. By re-engaging in the thing you were actually called to do way back here. My calling has not stopped on your life, Peter, just because you denied me. Okay. Do you love me? You know I love you. Do you love me? You know I love you. Then Peter, get to work. Begin to live like you love me. Principle is this. God's love language is trust and obedience. He has displayed love to you and I in every conceivable way that we could receive love from God if we're willing to receive it. But the way God experiences love, the way God has shown love, his love language is trust and obedience. They're equally important. Because it isn't sufficient to simply say, I trust God, and then to not obey him. The way we display that we actually trust is by our willingness to submit our preferences, our lives, our desires, our ambitions to him. I know it's not in the love language book because it would be sort of weird to say, and the other love language is obedience. But when we're talking about the Lord, trust and obedience are the way that we express affection and love to God. I'm going to invite you to stand with me. Our prayer ministry teams are going to be here on both sides in just a few moments to pray with you if you have any needs at all. Tonight over at the Palmer campus, we're celebrating Chris and Lori Miller. Just so you know, they're not actually going anywhere. They love Alaska and Palmer. They will probably go some sunny places a little more often. But Chris is still going to be on our teaching team and rotation. In fact, he and Lori are going to be over here at the Wasilla campus for a little while after they step down from their role over there. But here's what I want you to know. Tonight we have an opportunity to celebrate them. Years of faithfulness and service in that community. And so I'd invite you to come out to that. Bring a dish. It's a potluck. And I know I'm actually looking to see what Cars is cooking for it. So should be great. Jesus, here we are. Part of the intention of your word is that it would sort of cut through all the other stuff. As it's described, that it divides asunder. It pulls apart all of the things going on in our hearts and our minds, and it gives us clarity. And that's my prayer today, is that you would give us clarity, that it would come with conviction, not condemnation, but that we would find ourselves challenged to be in you, to hear from you, to trust you, and that trust would turn into action, that we would align our lives with your words. Would you give us the strength and the grace and the supernatural power to do that? In Jesus' name we pray. Amen and amen. Prayer ministry teams are here on both sides. Church, we love you. Grace and peace to you. We will see you next Sunday or tonight. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening. For more of our podcasts and to discover how you can connect, visit us at churchak.org or download our Church on the Rock AK app from either iTunes or Google Play.